Recording in progress.
Kayaknya bumi lagi sakit. Bu, apa kabar, Bu? Kiara rindu. Andai udah di kota ini bersih, mungkin sekarang Ibu masih ada. Bahagia di sana ya, Bu. Mimpi apa aku barusan? Aku jadi ingat sesuatu. Mudah-mudahan belum terlambat. Ya.
Hai Kiara, ada apa nak?
Aku pengen cerita. Semalam aku mimpi dunia menjadi lebih baik.
Sebentar, jangan buru-buru ya. Duduk dulu.
Ya, semalam aku mimpi aneh, tapi indah. Tentang dunia ini ya. Semalam aku mimpi melintasi waktu dengan beralih menuju tahun 2050. Keadaannya sudah sangat berbeda. Semua orang sudah memakai panel surya dan ada motor listrik juga. Terasa udaranya sangat segar sekali. Orang-orang sudah menggunakan mobil listrik. Gak perlu isi bensin, karena di setiap rumah sudah ada charger untuk mobilnya. Jalanannya pun sudah sangat teratur dan terintegrasi. Karena di zaman itu, aku lihat orang-orang sudah membiasakan ride sharing. Aku melanjutkan perjalanan menuju tahun 2040. Di sana sudah tak ada lagi energi fosil. Semuanya sudah menjadi energi terbarukan ya. Tata ruang kota sudah rapi, sehingga orang-orang banyak yang berjalan kaki dan bersepeda. Transportasi juga sudah sangat memadai. Salah satunya ada high speed rail system yang sudah berjalan di negeri ini loh ya. Begitu pula dengan pesawat yang sudah berbahan bakar hidrogen. Hingga di tahun 2050, negara ini menjadi begitu asri dan benar-benar memakai energi terbarukan. Dan aku yakin ayah bisa membuatnya jadi kenyataan. Ini demi ibu ya.
Ya, jaga Kiara baik-baik ya. Pastikan dia dapat masa depan yang cerah ya.
Pasti Bu. Ibu nggak usah khawatir ya. Ayah tahu harus berbuat apa, nak. Ayah akan bikin mimpimu jadi kenyataan, nak.
Terima kasih ya, Ayah.
Kamu harus giat belajar, ya nak ya. Agar kamu menjadi bagian dari perubahan. Dan yang terpenting, mimpimu bisa jadi kenyataan, ya.
Iya, Ayah.
Hadirin yang kami hormati, demi menjaga kelancaran kegiatan kita hari ini, perkenankan saya mengingatkan housekeeping rules untuk kegiatan hari ini. Acara ini diselenggarakan secara hybrid di Museum Nasional Jakarta Pusat dan melalui Zoom serta disiarkan langsung melalui kanal YouTube IESR. Bagi Anda yang bergabung melalui Zoom, silahkan mengganti nama akun Anda dengan format nama_organisasi. Selama acara berlangsung, mikrofon Bapak Ibu akan dinonaktifkan jika sedang tidak berbicara. Pertanyaan dapat diajukan oleh Bapak Ibu melalui kolom chat yang tersedia pada aplikasi Zoom. Sementara bagi para hadirin yang hadir di Museum Nasional, dapat mengajukan pertanyaan pada sesi tanya jawab nanti. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Respectable the Chief of Staff, Office of the President Indonesia, Mr. General Muldoko PhD or his representative, Mr. Hageng Nugroho, the key expert staff in the field of energy at the Office of the President Indonesia, Honorable the Manager Program of Energy Transformation, Leon Arinaldo, Honorable to our speaker today from Center for Global Sustainability, United States of America, Professor Dr. Nathan Haltman, Honorable to our moderator, Ms. Prita Laura, expert staff for the communication, the Office of the President Indonesia, and respectable to all of you online and offline participants, welcome to public lecture, the U.S. All-in Climate Policy and Action and Indonesia's Priority Programs. First of all, let's praise our God who has given us some mercies and blessings so that we can attend this event without any troubles and obstacles. I am Febrina Rizayati. It is an awesome and precious chance for me to be your master of ceremony in today's discussion in our precious public lecture. Meeting Paris Agreement's goal requires rapid decarbonization of entire economies and industries, not only for the United States or Indonesia, but it has to do globally. As we know that U.S. policy development has the potential to impact other countries because the U.S. position as global economy leaders. To inform updated and future climate policy development in the U.S. and implication to Indonesia-U.S. relation on energy and climate change, Institute for Essential Services Reform, in collaboration with the Executive Office of the President, initiate public lecture on the U.S. All-in Climate Policy and Indonesia's Development Priority Programs. It is a good platform for the Indonesian public to discuss the topic of U.S. climate policy and potential future mutually beneficial relationship between Indonesia and U.S. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, step on to the following agenda. The first is welcoming speech from Office of the President Indonesia to Mr. Hageng Nugroho. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. On behalf of the Executive Office of the President, I'll bring you all of the goodwill of Indonesia and greeting of peace. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Open the mask. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you here this morning in the Monument National Jakarta, for the opening of the public lecture on the U.S. All-in Climate Policy and Action and Indonesia Priority Program. On behalf of the Executive Office of the President, I extend a very warm welcome to all the participants today. Then let me express my gratitude to IASR for organizing this opportunity. To be honest, this is the first opportunity for us from the Executive Office of the President talk, discuss, and shows a concrete support to the climate issues on international environment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are known the effort to lower emission and ambition to make our lovely Earth better is not easy. There has been a long process and timely since the first COP meeting until the last year's the 20 meetings in Glasgow, UK. 189 countries are ratified to comply and support the global action on climate change. What happened in the US under the President Joe Biden administration is a huge leap of support on climate issues. I'm sure that it's not easy. However, in the future, world acknowledge the US is making history on climate change issues. And today we are open to hear and discuss on those climate plans and actions. One of the example, recently President Joe Biden approved the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, signing into law the most sweeping climate and energy bills ever enacted in the US. Given the US position as the global economic leaders, obviously the policy and could magnify climate movement around the world. The size of economic and the population of US could trigger as well as influence other countries to make similar actions as the US. Indonesia, as one of the countries ratified the Paris Agreement, was eager to take the same path and open to cooperate with. As you may be aware, President Joko Widodo consistently speaks about climate change on international forum. One of the was on the Adaptation Summit in 2021. President Joko Widodo mentioned that the impacts of climate change is real. People are suffers from flood, drought, and other disasters. To accelerate the efforts to combat the climate change, any country should do first, at least 4 things. First, comply the national determined contribution, encourage the citizens and potential stakeholders to participate, strengthen the global partnership. Indonesia priority is to scale up the cooperation on capacity building, like what we are doing today. And the last one is boosting the green economic development. More on that, President Joko Widodo also pushed the effort to be concrete. He refused this to see those things are only on policies and regulations. Ladies and gentlemen, our latest manifestation was bringing up sustainable transition on G20 presidency main focus. The complexity of the G20 countries are expected to be stimulus accelerating the energy transition process, especially since the G20 contributed 80% of the world economy. The G20 countries also implemented energy transition strategies to achieve the net zero emission in accordance with its country economic, social, and technological capability starting 2050 and up to 2070. Indonesia has started commitment to achieve its carbon neutral target by 2060. To add that, Indonesia has the presidency of the G20 looking forward to identify new areas to cooperation. The energy transition become a potential economic lever, given the large number of investment, massive involvement of local workers and industries. Knowing the dynamics of the climate change, the government encouraged encountering numerous challenges and implementations, funding, policy, which would be addressed by tight collaboration between private sectors, industries, and international partners. I aware USA has taken a big step against the climate change, and we wish that the conference will give us reference to discuss, educate, mitigate, and plan ahead for the future mutually beneficial relationship between Indonesia and USA for the sake of sustainability. Last, I would like once again strengthen the message from the presidents to foster the solidarity, collaboration through the global collective leadership and consistently oversees the implementation for action on every country. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yeah, let's give big applause for Mr. Hageng Nugroho. Thank you, Mr. Hageng, for the speech. The second speech will be delivered by the ISR Manager Program of Energy Transformation, the Mr. Deon Arinaldo. You might take the floor.
Okay, thank you and good morning for all the participants that has come to our public lecture event session today. For the participants that is already spend his or her time taking his time to come to the to this National Museum, I would like to express my gratitude, and also for all the participants that is attending the lecture through the Zoom meeting. I would also like to express our gratitude. And of course, I will not be long here. I think we are all here waiting for the same thing. We want to learn more on the U.S. climate all-in policy, and then probably for that in this opportunity we have the best speaker to kind of present what is happening in the U.S. domestically, and we also would like to know what would happen in the future based on this policy, especially in relation to the Indonesia and U.S. And without further ado, before we start the session, I would like to express our sincere gratitude for the Executive Office of the President, Pak Hageng, Bu Wita Laura, dan teman-teman KSP lain, for all the collaboration and cooperation to make this event ongoing now. And we also like to express our gratitude to, of course, the Professor Ned Altman from the Center for Global Sustainability, University of Maryland, and all the colleagues from the Center for Global Sustainability for taking all of your time and spending it with us this morning. And yeah, so I think we, before we start, I also like to apologize for the technical difficulties that we had, so that we kind of like have this event started half an hour late. I hope that the discussion following this would still be a lively discussion, and we could still learn a lot from this very rare opportunity. And with that, again, I will say thank you again for all the collaborators and supporters for all this event, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Mr. Deon, for the speech. Ladies and gentlemen, now we will start our discussion by the theme, the U.S. All-in Climate Policy and Action and Indonesia's Priority Programs, which will be started by a presentation from our speaker, Professor Dr. Nathan Haltman. And after the presentation from Professor Dr. Nathan Haltman, it will directly continue to the question and answer session. And this discussion will be moderated by Ms. Prita Laura. So without any further ado, please welcome by giving a big applause to Professor Dr. Nathan Haltman and Ms. Prita Laura.
Selamat pagi teman-teman sekalian, Bapak Ibu, Mas Ageng, Mas Aas, kemudian juga Mas Deon, kemudian Mas Agusari, dan juga mungkin tidak bisa sebutkan satu persatu. Kalau bicara soal lingkungan, climate change, orangnya itu lagi ya, ketemunya dia lagi. Nah, sekarang kita kalau bicara when we talk about climate change, climate change action and also policy. Lesson learned will be very important, because this is something very new. So the lesson learned will be playing a very significant role. And today we have opportunity to learn from the U.S. climate change policy and also strategic in the long term and also middle term, in a national level and subnational level also. From the one who really involved in the policy making process, Mr. Nate Haltman. I would like to read about his bio first. Mr. Nate Haltman is the founder and director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland and a professor in the School of Public Policy. His work focuses on developing, setting, and achieving ambitious national climate goals. This includes U.S. emission mitigation policy, rapid coal phase-out strategies in diverse national contexts, and economy-wide emission strategies in G20 countries. With a focus on China, Indonesia, India, and others, he was recently senior advisor for the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at the U.S. Department of State, where he led writing of the 2021 U.S. long-term strategy and helped negotiate the U.S.-China joint Glasgow Declaration at COP26. Wow, that's great. Let's give a big applause. That's a big thing. And he was also a lead author of several recent assessment of U.S. national climate strategies and emission targets in advance of the announcement of the U.S. 2030 climate target. And in the Obama White House, he helped develop the 2025 U.S. NDC and participate in the Paris climate negotiation. Professor Haltman is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He holds a PhD in Energy and Resources from the University of California, Berkeley. Ya, tidak diragukan lagi ya Bapak Ibu ya, kita akan banyak belajar dari Profesor Nate Haltman di sini. Nanti kita pun juga punya kesempatan untuk bertanya. You have chance to ask to Mr. Nate Haltman, after the lecture. And before we start this conversation, I asked before to Mr. Haltman that can we achieve the 1.5 degree target? Is it possible? Because of this current event, the conflict between Ukraine and also the financial crisis and the food crisis, it makes us, it is a moment of stepping stone or a moment to stepping backwards about the target. And he mentioned and he answered my question very sharp, and now we would like to learn about that answer and also what we can learn and collaborate between Indonesia and America as a strategic partnership. Thank you, and please, the floor is yours, Mr. Nate Haltman.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction and framing question. I also very much want to extend my gratitude, my deep gratitude to the Executive Office of the President, as well as IESR for co-hosting this event. And it is a great pleasure to also be here at the National Museum, where there are so many amazing pieces of Indonesia's history to be seen. So I very much appreciate the hosts and the venue that we're in. And with that, I want to mention, even before we go to my slides to walk through a little bit of detail on the topics of the day, starting out by just saying we are at a unique moment in our global history around how we're thinking about sustainability, climate, and economic development. And that is why I'm here with our team. And that is why I think we're having this conversation. Around the world, our governments have long been talking about someday we'll do more on climate change. And we know climate change is going to be a problem, and we're going to be starting to do some work soon. I think that in the last few years, what we've realized is two things. Number one, we are actually going to do this. It's going to be happening because we know we need to do it because of the climate. We know we need to make that action globally. I think the Paris Agreement was the first big sort of movement on that, but the IPCC 1.5 degree warming report was the scientific community saying we really need to get serious. The second thing that is a catalyst to our being here is that we think now, not only do we have to do it, but we can do it. And we can do it in a way that will actually be a new pathway for all of us, that will be a better pathway for all of us. It will be a cleaner pathway, a pathway that is improving the lives of our citizens and the people who live in our countries in diverse ways, in diverse countries, right? So this is all, each country has its own specific situation, its own context. And the way we're going to be able to do that is by being flexible, creative, and learning from each other as rapidly as we can. And I think that for many years, this has been sort of a slow conversation between the US and Indonesia. I've seen a genuine refocusing of interest and attention and understanding between our two countries what each other's situation is domestically, what each other's politics are domestically, and what we can do together, both through governments, but also through our broader civil society and even like our research communities, like we're doing today, how we can better collaborate to help each of us do better and do faster and make an improvement for our people. So that's just a big initial framing. So maybe what we can do is go to the slides, and I'll tell you a little bit more. And I very much appreciate the invitation from IESR and the President Executive Office to explain a little bit more about US climate policy and action. And one thing that I will also say, if we could go to the first slide, I don't know if you have it available, we'll just start there. I'm sure it's in progress, so I'll yeah. I can continue, but there they go. I knew it would come. So, but this is just a title slide, so it's not a big deal. But one of the things that I'm very happy to say is that I've given versions of this talk for I don't know, 15 years or something like that, and I've always said I think the United States can do this, but most of the time it's been a partial answer as to how. I think that today, for the first time, the answer as to how is really becoming much more concrete and clear. We don't have all of the pieces in place that we will need to hit our very ambitious 2030 and 2050 goals, but we now, as of the past roughly 8 weeks, I feel much happier being in front of you and explaining how the US will get to its goal, because we've really, as you heard in the introductory comments, the United States has put down a new set of actions and investments that will put us squarely on a good path toward achieving our target. So I'll explain more in my talk about that. The first slide you see here is really just an introductory slide. I'm happy to make these slides available, and I don't need to talk through this a lot, but I just want to introduce where we're coming from. There's 4 of us here today from the Center for Global Sustainability. We are a research center at the major research university in the Washington, D.C. area. We're located about 4 miles from Washington in the metropolitan area of D.C. And then we work on a diverse set of questions relating to understanding pathways to higher ambition for national and subnational climate, energy, and development strategies. So we bring a lot of diverse types of tools, analytical tools to bear on this set of questions. We're clearly, as you heard, we're involved in our policy discussion in Washington, but we also think it's quite important to provide evidence of the pathways to our policy communities, both in the US and globally. And we do that through a diverse set of tools like integrated assessment models, econometric and empirical work, other kinds of mixed methods, and even normative and values-based inquiries. So if you're interested in learning more, always happy to talk. And we're here to make connections and build bridges to the research community here as well. Next slide, please, and then we'll start with the substantive part of the discussion. Okay, so here's the question that I was asked. Can the world reach a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory? My talk today will not be on the science of 1.5. It will not be addressing the urgency of reaching that goal or the reasons why 1.5 is a better goal than 2 degrees. Suffice it to say that the scientific community of the world, alongside the governments of the world, have decided that we all very much need to be aiming for achieving a 1.5 degree world. We know that that world will be a better world, will be less climate change, it will be a cleaner world, it will be safer for our people if we can achieve it. And so the question is, can we do so? We talked a little bit about this earlier. So I'll speak a little bit today about the US case, but I wanted to put this a little bit more in context. Next slide. So the way we're doing this globally, I think, is most or probably all of you know, out of the Paris Agreement, that agreement essentially called on all countries to communicate the way that in their own domestic contexts, in their own national strategy, they seek to achieve a climate compatible pathway, recognizing different circumstances and development contexts across the world. One of the ways that this is communicated to the global community is through these targets called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And if we look at the contributions of the big country, in fact, all of the countries through their NDCs to the global emissions pathway, what we can see is that we are some of the way there, but not all of the way there. The national targets themselves are diverse in how ambitious they are. And of course, that means that we should always be reevaluating in all of our country contexts whether we can do more, given that the world is changing very rapidly and energy technology costs are dropping very rapidly. And we're learning a lot more about how to reduce other emissions like emissions from methane and other non-CO2s, and to address agriculture. So we always have to be reevaluating this. And this was one of the outcomes from the Glasgow COP last year, which called on all countries to reassess and undertake a continuous reevaluation of the ambition of their own national climate targets. We know that's going to be necessary. Next slide. And one way to think about this story of that we're partway there, but not all of the way there, is to essentially look at the aggregation of where the NDCs get us. If we could go to the next slide, there's a graphic there. What we're trying to do is look at where the NDCs have currently gotten us. And what I would say is that compared to where we were as you heard before, I was in the White House under Obama administration as well. And compared to that time of our NDCs, we have made significant and I think heartening progress. We have been able to assess, and the next photo will show that there's some analysis that we've done out of our group that shows how much the NDCs that we currently have in advance of COP26 have moved us along the pathway toward a 1.5 degree world. And what you can see from that, what you can see from that graphic is that we're about halfway there. The NDCs themselves bring us down to about a 2 degree pathway, but obviously more needs to be done. Could we have the next slide? Okay, there we go. So what you can see, there's a small circle there that shows where the NDCs are. And what you can see is compared to where we were earlier, we've made substantial progress. And I think that's owing to these two things that I mentioned earlier. Number one, that our countries, I think, around the world have a lot more political support. They have a lot more momentum to try to do something. And at the same time, the technology options have actually expanded dramatically and the costs have come down significantly. Both of those factors have made it possible for countries to enhance their climate targets in advance of COP26. And what we found in our work, and this has been corroborated in a number of other studies, is that what we know we've done now is gotten the world on roughly a 2 or 1.9, 1.8 compatible pathway, assuming we continue to implement the goals we've put forward and continue to implement additional actions beyond that. What we also know from this analysis and other similar analyses is that it's still not enough to get us on a 1.5 degree compatible path, which will require even faster actions. Next slide. This is a resource that I would recommend to you if you're interested in understanding more about the national climate targets, and those who are in the field would probably know this one already. But this is Climate Action Tracker, which is based out of Europe, and they do some very good work, and I can certainly recommend it if you're interested in looking at different aspects of national climate strategies. What we know from both this analysis that I'm showing you here, the analysis that we did, analysis that have been coming out across the world in key scientific publications, are shown in the right-hand side here. We have made good progress. We should recognize that we have made significant progress on this topic, even in the last 10 years. Even in the last 5 years, I would say. We're still not on a 1.5 trajectory, and that keeping 1.5 in reach is still possible, but we only have a few years, I would argue, probably about 5 years to make sure we're continuing to accelerate our action enough to keep that option open. Next slide. And with this, I think I'll turn, I believe at this point, one more. One of the things I wanted to highlight, given Indonesia's leadership this year in the G20, and actually even next year in ASEAN, is featured on this slide. One of the kind of features of the way the math works of emissions in climate change is that the G20 countries collectively represent, frankly, most of the emissions. And similarly, reductions of emissions in the G20 can actually go pretty far toward getting the world onto a 1.5 compatible trajectory. In fact, this one study that I'm quoting here from Climate Action Tracker and the World Resources Institute shows that roughly 75% of the gap to 1.5 degrees can be narrowed through just the G20 countries alone. And what that means is that Indonesia's unique place this year, and I think ongoing voice in the G20 in coming years, will be critical to making sure that other countries, and Indonesia itself, of course, but other countries are listening to this important message and also helping to get on a climate compatible pathway. Next slide. Okay, so now let's turn to what you really wanted to hear, which was more about the United States and what we're doing. And like I said, I am actually much more happy to be giving this talk now than I was in the last many years, because we actually have a much stronger congressional action that's just happened, which I will tell you a little bit more about in a slide or two. This is President Biden announcing when he first came into office a couple months after he came into office in April of 2021, our new national climate target for 2030. And at the same time announcing other goals that you can see here. The 2030 climate target is a 50 to 52% reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions all gases, all sectors by 2030. We also set a goal for 100% clean electricity by 2035. That, by the way, is probably the hardest of our goals to hit because it requires us to get completely out of unabated fossil fuel by in the electricity sector by 2035, both coal and natural gas. And then also a 2050 net zero greenhouse gas emissions goal, which I will speak to a little bit later in the talk. Next slide, please. This is a graphical representation from our US long-term strategy. As you heard in the introduction, I led the writing for this report, although it was a very large effort across the US government to put the pieces together. And even some of the analysis from our group at Maryland came into play. But what this shows is essentially historical emissions, as you can see in the solid line up to about 2020, followed by dotted lines, which are indicative of our goals, our nationally determined contributions for 2025 and 2030, as well as our 2050 net zero goal. And what you can see here is roughly the pattern of reductions that we're going to need to follow in the United States to get from where we are today, which is in fact making progress from where we were in 2005, but the pace of change and the continuing effort is very clear that this is not something we can sort of create a lot of effort to 2030 and just stop. The marathon continues all the way till 2050, and it will be challenging the entire way. Next slide. So one of the features that I wanted to mention about US climate policy, and I think actually has similarities, not exact replicas in other countries, but similarities, resonances, echoes. There's sort of a kind of similar pattern that we see in many, if not all countries, which is that clearly the national government is critical. The national government is what leads the way. The national Congress or the national legislatures, the national governments set the policies that cover usually the entire energy sector, maybe the entire economy, agriculture, et cetera. But one thing is what we've learned in the United States, I will say, over the past few years, and I'll speak to this a little bit more, is that it's very important in our country to not just rely on only the national government. This really needs to be, because of the pace of change that's required, because of the fundamental, thoroughgoing nature of the energy transition that we know we need to effect in all of our different countries, this transition needs to be rooted not just from a top-down set of government laws and policies, but genuinely rooted in and embraced by all parts of society. That includes, of course, the citizens and communities. It includes the private sector, businesses and investors, and it includes the governments at the subnational level, such as cities or provinces or states. Each country is very different in how those pieces overlap, but all countries have all of those pieces. And I think that it's very important to work on understanding and working through these different kinds of organizations and government levels to ensure that the climate policies that are being implemented and decided on are rooted across all of society. As you see here in this graphic, this was made really for the US, but it's applicable more broadly. We have our states. Our states, for example, have a tremendous amount of leverage on electricity policy, such as the quantity of renewable energy in each state. That's just one example. I won't go examples through each one, but local governments, national government, business, and civil society all working together. And what we've seen in the United States in the past 5 or 6 years is the critical and central importance of this kind of strategy when governments inevitably kind of change over time, right? So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I have a few slides in sequence here. So I want to kind of make a little bit of a cartoon story here, but I think this is roughly correct. So an illustration, which has, by the way, this is not any like analytical, empirical. There's no scale on this climate action arrow as you see here. It's just sort of it's just for our thinking, So the standard view of U.S. action. And I admit, like most countries, it's very hard to understand other countries' domestic politics if you're not living in the country. And I think the US is the same way. Most of what you probably hear about the US is about national level politics, is about our presidents, what the presidents are saying. And of course, we had a very vocal president just one term ago. Next slide, please. Where we all know President Obama was very active in climate action. He pushed forward. We helped build the Paris Agreement collaboratively with other countries. So climate action, we know, grew in the United States over the Obama years. And then the standard view is that Trump came into office. This is, by the way, Donald Trump saying how little the Paris Agreement will do for the world or for the United States. He's going like this. It's very, very small. So he was saying, no, we're not going to do it. And the conventional view is that that meant climate action stops in the United States. Next slide. And then eventually Biden comes in and then climate action picks up again. And so we're kind of back to where we started. The general view is like, well, it was up, it was down, it was up. Okay, fine. Thanks, US. Like, you're back to where you started. I think that is the wrong view. And let me sort of explain why. Next slide, please. So a lot of work that we've done at our center has been on the US portfolio that we run, has been on not only national level policies, but also subnational policies and what they can add up to. Happy to make these graphics available, and you can see it's a little bit small. But when we looked at the all of society climate strategy in the United States, there are a lot of what I call policy authorities. In other words, ability to kind of make policy at different levels of government. We have a federal system in our country. That means that states and cities and other actors have a lot of ability to do this. Now, they can't do all of it on their own because they're not the national government, but they can do, it turns out, a lot. And this is what we found through our research. It's just, you can see there's a map here showing all the different actors, 4,000 businesses and investors, 25 states, in other words, half of our states, 650 universities, 580 cities, counties, and then 900 faith-based and cultural institutions. So all kinds of organizations, all doing what they could in their own context to drive ahead climate action. And what we found is that altogether, those represent over 70% of the US economy. That is equivalent to an economy the size of China's that is all taking action in their own domestic, in their own context to advance climate action. So yes, Trump was in office and there wasn't a lot happening at the federal level, but there was a lot of things happening from California, my state of Maryland, other places like that were pushing ahead. Next slide. And we've even quantified that, but I'm not going to bore you with all of those details. I'm happy to share the reports if you're interested. So the more integrated view that I think is important to think about for the US is as follows. So here's the kind of, new graphic that I'd suggest. So here's the more integrated view. Next slide, please. So Obama, everything, is going up. Trump goes down. That's the standard view. Next slide. So I think that what we have to remember is that those subnational actions helped actually push up and backfill some of what was happening at the federal level during the Trump years. And then the final slide that you see there, and I really think that we have shown evidence for this in our analysis, is that the expanding action from the subnational level actually makes it possible when there was a new leader coming in to do even more at the federal level. So when we look at our Inflation Reduction Act, when we look at our NDC, our nationally determined contribution of 50 to 52%, we can hit a higher goal now because of all the work that was happening, even under Donald Trump, pushing ahead the green economy during that period. So I think that's really an important point. I think we can do more now thanks to all that other work. And I think that's part of how I'd like to look at US climate policy. Next slide. Now let me transition a little bit into thinking about where we are today with US climate policy. And as we think about this all-in climate strategy, the way you can sort of cut it into lots of different categories, but basically the way I think of it is three different buckets or categories of action in the US. One of them is new laws from Congress. So new actions from the legislative branch of our government. A second category is new actions from our regulatory branches of government. In other words, similar to your executive office of the president, we have also the executive agencies. Their job is to implement laws that are already on the books, and they can do that through regulations. And so the second category is new regulations through the executive branch. And then the third category is all of this diverse aspects of subnational actions, such as state electricity policy, city municipal buses and EVs, charging infrastructure, and more. Next slide. And when we look at the recent actions from the US, I'm going to take 2 slides and just explain in a little bit more detail what we've gotten out of the recent legislation. So first, which might have been a little hard to catch because it was all happening right before Glasgow. But basically, last year, we actually got one of the major investments in our climate policy in the US focused on new infrastructure investment. And as we all know, infrastructure is a really important part of emissions. So that includes things like public transit. It includes electric vehicle charging stations. It includes sustainable ports and sustainable transportation in lots of ways. And it includes our electricity transmission grid and power management systems. So all of those pieces got significant funding last year in 2021 as part of something we called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. That put over $500 billion into sustainable types of infrastructure, which are listed here. Next slide. And then we get to the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which was the one we heard about earlier in the introduction today. The Inflation Reduction Act put nearly another $375 billion directly into programs that will support reducing emissions in the US in 5 different diverse contexts. And you can see them here. They lower consumer energy costs. So one of the things that I think is shared across all of our countries is that we are all concerned about the possible risks to consumers, to people who are particularly poorer, more economically vulnerable, if we're doing an energy transition. We want to make the energy transitions affordable, and we want to make sure that they're not harming the lowest income parts of society as we're doing it. Now, I think that there are lots of ways we can do this in a way that, because the energy technology costs are now cheaper, are going to be not too difficult to do, not as difficult as they might have been 10 years ago. We have many more options to make this an achievable goal, to make sure that our people are not unreasonably harmed. But in our US Inflation Reduction Act, that was actually central. So the point was, there was a lot of funding to support local communities in the energy transition and to make sure that costs were not unreasonably high to support the deployment of new clean energy infrastructure. A second thing is, I think all of our countries share across the G20 and more, is thinking about domestic industry and domestic manufacturing. As we know, that's always really important to our economies. It's important to the businesses, the investors, to jobs, to making sure people have good employment. And so in our Inflation Reduction Act, they provided significant support to supporting manufacturing industries to switch over to lower emissions kinds of manufacturing over time. Obviously, you can't do it overnight. There's often big infrastructure and big investments that need to be made in manufacturing facilities, but this provides some support for that, including support for retooling existing manufacturing facilities and for building cleaner new facilities when that comes up. A third element is decarbonizing the economy through what we call, basically what it is tax credits and financial incentives, but basically we call it the production tax credits and investment tax credits. What that essentially does is it makes it more cost efficient for industry and for businesses to install cleaner types of electricity generation like solar and wind, just as a very simple story. And then fourth, investing in communities and environmental justice. This is something that I think, again, all of our countries will be dealing with in different ways. We all have different aspects of this energy transition that influence and impact communities. And we're very concerned, all of us, I think, about how different and diverse communities might be negatively impacted. So it's critically important for both the sustainability of the energy transition, as well as also sustaining, frankly, the politics of the transition, to make sure that these communities are well supported over time. And so our Inflation Reduction Act included some grants and financial support for communities to build greater resilience and also to transition to newer sources of energy. And then finally, just like in Indonesia, there's a large land sector in the United States, land use sector, so agriculture, forestry, Obviously very different in our two countries in terms of how those sectors operate, but they're still an important part of our overall economy. And so there were some provisions in there to ensure that in the land sector, this transition is supported. And next slide. So that's a quick summary of the different kinds of provisions in these two acts. They're collectively expected to help get us much of the way, although not all of the way, to our ambitious climate goals. This is a result of one of our studies showing how to get to the 2030 goal that we've put forward and what emissions reductions need to be taken in each sector. There's obviously more detail in this study I won't go through today. But what this shows is that the Inflation Reduction Act, the other acts from Congress, are centrally important. They're like the critical pillar of achieving these 50% goals. But I also don't want to overstate the case. Our work is not done in the United States as of today. We have a lot more to do. Our states have to continue to do more work. And in fact, even our federal government has to continue to do more work, particularly through the regulatory actions, right? The congressional actions, I think, that category is pretty good right now. But the congressional actions, the executive actions, the regulatory actions, those need to continue to happen. Our state and subnational actions also need to be happen over the rest of the decade. We're only in 2022. These provisions will have to continue to be rolled out over time. Next slide. I'll speak with just a couple of slides on our net zero goal. So all of what I've talked about thus far is really about 2030, although admittedly, a lot of the congressional actions you've heard about will have actions that not only extend to 2030, but also extend beyond 2030 in terms of their impact on overall US emissions. But it is important to note that the US has set, like many other countries, a net zero goal. That's all greenhouse gases, including methane, nitrous oxide, of course, CO2, and others by 2050. And so that's a very important part of our overall climate trajectory. I was, as you heard, helped sort of put together the report that we put out in at the Glasgow COP explaining how we anticipate getting to that goal. But like all of these, I think it will be important for the US to revisit this goal. Frankly, I don't have the ability to make this decision, but I hope that they will revisit it every couple of years at least to update and to refresh thinking about where the most salient or most significant opportunities are. Next slide. And this is just a figure showing where we see in the US context, where we see our biggest reductions happening between roughly now and 2050. This doesn't, take into account all of the historical reductions. This is just from today's moment forward. And what you can see here is that there's a significant amount of reductions that we see in, for example, the energy portion of our overall economy. So that'll be particularly in electricity sector and transportation. What that means is that we'll continue on our, frankly, relatively good pace right now of probably phasing out coal by 2030 and continuing to phase out gas without CCS by 2035. I think that's both of those goals we're on track to do at this point. Another dimension of this will be moving toward rapid deployment of electric vehicle fleet that will probably see us with roughly 50% sales of new vehicles being electric by 2030, and then rapidly moving toward nearly full sales of electric vehicles by about 5 to 10 years after that. That'll be a second really critical pillar. The 2030 to 2040 decades are going to be necessary to go beyond electricity and transportation, however. And this is a pattern we see across all countries, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. If I could have the next slide, please. So in our country, electricity and transport are really critical. I recognize that the text might be a little small here, but one of the things that we've done a lot of work on long-term strategies in our group, not just for the US, but also for lots of other country contexts. And there are several patterns that emerge as common across essentially every country. And those patterns are very broadly speaking as follows. Number one, thinking about electricity, we all have to clean up the electricity. So go from like in the US, a very heavily, originally coal and fossil fueled electricity grid, increasingly supported by solar, wind, and other kinds of renewables. Now, the renewables might be different in every country. Perhaps there's more geothermal resource here in Indonesia, for example, that can be tapped than what we have in the United States. But generally speaking, cleaning up electricity and going to it as quickly as possible, 100% clean electricity will be a critical pillar for all countries to get to net zero. Secondly, once that electricity, or as that electricity is being cleaned up, what we also need to do is switch as many uses as possible from fossil fuels or emitting fuels over to electricity. So think about a vehicle as an example of this. Right now, even in the US and here, most of our vehicles are fueled by petroleum in some form or another, right? What we all need to be thinking about is rapidly moving those vehicles away from petroleum to electric vehicles that are fueled by clean electricity. And there's other examples beyond transportation of uses like this. So for example, in buildings, can move potentially heating in the US, we might be able to move heating, and in Europe too, by the way, away from gas or away from combustion heating toward electric heat pumps, which are a more efficient way to do heating and cooling. And they also can use clean electricity. So that also helps move our building sector toward more toward a cleaner direction. A third, which is category across all economic sectors, which I think many of you are already familiar with, is cutting energy waste. So improving efficiency in all sectors will, of course, reduce the amount of emissions from all sectors. Another category is to look at non-CO2 emissions. And I want to make a short endorsement here for something that's come up recently, and I was involved in State Department as well, which is that I think we as a global community have realized that there are many more near-term opportunities to reduce methane in our countries than we thought before. And that's been kind of a positive surprise, that methane reductions seem to be maybe cheaper, they maybe seem to be more pervasive than we thought might be possible. And so looking at three different sectors, our energy sector through oil and gas industry, as well as coal, looking at agricultural sector through farming practices and cattle and other kinds of livestock practices. And then finally looking at waste processing as a way to reduce methane emissions. So many countries signed the Global Methane Pledge at COP26, committing to a global 30% reduction by 2030. We just did an analysis that shows the US itself can hit a 30% by 2030 methane reduction. And I think it'll be great for all countries to look at the methane opportunity, because methane reductions actually create the possibility toward keeping us in the near-term decades closer on our 1.5 pathway. And then finally, there's opportunities for something called CO2 removal. You can think of this in two different ways. One of it's expanding forest areas to absorb more CO2 from our biosphere, from our forest sinks. Another, though, could be through technological strategies such as carbon dioxide removal. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just a summary of where the US is. I do think that we're on a great path toward 2030 reductions. We are going to need to be reducing those emissions as rapidly as possible in the less expensive sectors right now. I would say transportation and electricity very much to start. But I do think that as we hit the 2030 decade, 2040 decade, we will have to look at harder to decarbonize sectors such as manufacturing. And that's an area where I think there needs to be global collaboration on how to understand how our steel industries, cement, maybe aviation fuels, and others can transition as we get not just the near-term reductions, which we know how to do well, but reductions, say, in the 2040s that will need to keep us all on pace to hitting that net zero goal. Next slide. Okay, and then this slide is just a little bit on Indonesia and the US. And as I mentioned in my framing comment, I think that what I've seen is a very rapidly renewed interest as this administration has come in toward better understanding what Indonesia's domestic context is in terms of the energy transition, how to make it just, clean, and affordable within the Indonesian context. Some of the work that our group has done with IESR, for example, has been on understanding some of those pathways within the electricity sector, and we've been very grateful to be able to collaborate on exciting new kinds of research in that area. But obviously, that's just one example of many types of interactions that we think need to be happening across the US and Indonesia so that the US gets a better sense of what it can do to better support the just, clean, and affordable energy transition in Indonesia. So one thing there is that I think, as I mentioned at the top, that Indonesia has a very critical voice in, for example, the G20 and in the international conversation, for example, at the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as other venues and forums, such as ASEAN. And so Indonesia's, I know, been very active, as we heard in the framing comments, about thinking about the impacts of climate change in Indonesia, thinking about what Indonesia will be doing as it reviews its nationally determined contribution over time, as it reviews its already ambitious 2060 net zero goal. Sometimes we find that we can do more as we learn more about the opportunities. I'm not saying that will happen in Indonesia. I'm just saying that's happened in the US sometimes. And so hopefully, as we all continue to look at these opportunities, we might find new areas for action as we work on it together. For the United States' part, as you probably all have heard, as you know, like my former boss, I'm not speaking for the US government in any way here, by the way. And just, I'm in an independent university right now. So that's, my comments are only from that perspective. But my former boss, I can certainly say, is very committed to doing what he can and what the US can to help the key economies, including Indonesia, around the world to do whatever we can do to help. And so I think that there's a renewed interest in, for example, there's something called the Just Energy Transitions Partnership through the G7, for example. But I think all of us are learning about what can and ought to be done and what would be a good pathway, what would be helpful for the Indonesian context. And through our work at the Center for Global Sustainability, but our work more broadly as a shared US-Indonesia community, I think there's great interest and excitement to better understand and learn from your experience, just as we're happy to share our experiences. All of us have to be thinking about this together and creatively. And so you saw at the very end there, I have opportunities for new research areas, new collaborations. I think all of those are areas that we can work together, not just at the University of Maryland, although we're delighted to do that, but also across our shared community, thinking about coal phase down, thinking about how to deploy renewable energy, thinking about these hard to decarbonize sectors in industry, thinking about peatland and forest strategies, and also understanding the finance part of it, how we can do better to finance the transitions and where concretely we can apply finance to make a real difference in the next few years, rather than thinking, in my view, about the broad, huge numbers, which are very intimidating and maybe a little bit hard to think about. What can we do today? What are the real opportunities at hand now? Next slide, please. And I think that's it. So thank you all for your attention, and I'm very happy to go to our discussion now. Okay.
Insightful presentation. Silakan ya Bapak Ibu, jika mau bertanya, if you want to ask anything, please raise your hand. And also the audience that join us in the Zoom, you can ask at the chat box. And nanti panitia bisa ini ya Mas Dion ya, lihatnya di chat bagaimana? Nanti ditampilkan. Okay. Before I go to the audience, I will ask you first. You know that we can see that, as you mentioned before, U.S. government now has a very strong, I said it's strong, strong commitment on climate change policy. But do you also have a problem as we face Indonesia, that the president, the government has a strong policy, strong commitment on that issue, but the gap is very big on the implementation? Do you also have that problem, and how you resolve that problem?
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. We do. I think every country struggles with implementation. I'm more involved in in some ways the easy part, which is setting the goal, and the hard part is doing the work to implement it. So That is it's a good question. I do think that it depends in the US on the specific sector and the specific policy tool. In the US, we do have very good, generally regulatory enforcement, right? So once something's like made into law, we have a lot of resources to make sure that the industry complies with those laws. On the other hand, sometimes we have arguments in the courts about whether the laws are okay, right? So that can sort of slow things down. And I think that that's part of our system. So again, once everything gets implemented, or once everything gets decided through Congress, implemented through the executive agencies, and run through the courts, we're pretty good at implementation. But sometimes things can get stuck in the courts, and there can be kind of problems that come up in that context. So I don't want to say this is all done and perfect. It's definitely not. There will be continued battles to fight. But I think that with the actions that I've outlined, most of that I think we can rely on, because a lot of it's actually about spending, not about regulation. And spending is, let's put it this way. If you think about our Congress, they all represent geographical areas, in the United States. And when those geographical areas benefit from the spending, the representatives are happy because there's jobs, there's spending going in their area. So some of the spending related stuff is actually a little bit easier to implement. It doesn't generally get opposed. It's more this regulatory piece that sometimes gets caught up.
Yeah, like in renewable energy policy. Yeah, we face how to get economical price. Yeah, to for the industry. That's the problem that we cannot answer until now. Yeah, that's one of the example. So I want to know what U.S. government do to close the gap, especially about the renewable energy economical price.
Yeah. So our electricity pricing system is, I think, has some differences between us and Indonesia. And so one of the things that the way that the government is doing it the governments are doing it in our countries, I think sort of think about it in two ways. One way is that through this new infrastructure act that I talked about, they're providing essentially a direct financial subsidy to the purchasing of renewable energy. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically what it does. It's essentially providing more profits to the renewable energy companies that are putting in the wind and solar.
So you give incentive like that.
There's an incentive. It's actually, for those of you who follow this, it's a per kilowatt hour incentive. Like it's like of renewable energy, they give an extra little bit to the companies so that they have a little bit more profit from installing that. So that's one mechanism that we use. It's called a production tax credit. The other mechanisms that we use, which are not at the national level, but are at the state level, is many states have something called a renewable portfolio standard, which mandates a minimum amount of renewable energy in the electricity grid in that state. And again, that's more complicated. It's confusing because it's state by state. We have 50 states, but like there's 25 states or so that have something like that. Okay. So there's a few different mechanisms that we can use, and the pricing, there's also some relief. There's actually some pricing relief for low-income households that also comes out of the Inflation Act. So in other words, a little bit of financial support for, again, think of the lowest income communities, households. They get a little bit of extra support for their bill so they don't have to pay as much.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you for your explanation. Ada yang mau bertanya tadi? Silakan. Tadi sudah angkat tangan lebih dahulu. Mas Aas, silakan.
Thank you very much. Nathan. I'm Ahmad Agustiawan. I'm from the Office of Executive President and also lecturer at the Universitas Gadjah Mada. It's very interesting the dynamics of energy and also climate policy in the US. In fact, during my lecture, I also bring a book of NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. It used to be talking about the 2050 targets on how to bring renewable energy into system at the time it was only 80%, but now you bring 2035, 30 or 35? 35, yes, and 100%. It's quite what's it? Thinking very well, how to say it's moving
ambitious.
Yes, ambitious to say. At the time in this book, the NREL book, I thought it was ambitious at the time, but now moving towards this one, we see this is more ambitious. So what my question is that how to bring this kind of conceptual things and then planning into actions, and also that you move from one to others. And as you explained before, that when you get a different president, you get a new president, there was suddenly change in that things. How to make up these situations so that you still get the confidence of your people. And the thing is that about America is that you not talk only for American people, but also for the world. Once Trump say no for that things, it seems like, oh my God, now everything's changed. But then after that, Biden bring this a good point. The thing is that how we can learn from these situations, while in Indonesia we also have this kind of dynamics about the presidential things, decisions, and then the policy behind all these things. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Great question. I'll say two quick things. So first of all, that's a great example of what I was referring to, which is that as the US, when we've reviewed our options over the years, and even in the last 10 years, the world has changed rapidly in terms of what possibilities are. And so as we've reviewed those carefully every couple of years, new options, new ambition, all of a sudden does seem possible. And it doesn't magically appear, obviously. There's got to be, for example, I was involved in and our team was involved in the 2016 US long-term strategy report as well. That was done before, like the one I was showing you was from 2021, but there was one also in 2016 at the very end of the Obama administration when I used to be there. And that long-term strategy report had set a goal not of net zero 2050. It was 80% reductions only, not 100% reductions. It was 80% reductions by, we even called it mid-century. We were even too shy to call it 2050. We weren't totally sure we could hit it by 2050. So we said mid-century to give us a little bit of fuzziness on what we really meant by that. And so now in just the span of 5 years, the US has gone from 80% by who knows, 2055 or something, to net zero 2050. And who knows, I can't promise, but maybe we'll find more opportunities when we review this next time. So that does happen. I think that's a really great point to raise. And then the second point you're asking is about what happens during sort of presidential transitions. How do we ensure robustness? The shortest answer I can give to that is that, remember what I mentioned before about it's not all or nothing, right? It's not that the president comes in and then just turns everything off. A president doesn't have that level of power in the US. So there's all that other stuff that's still happening, but a president does matter. And so it certainly, you could look at it as being sort of a slowdown of action. And I think you make a very good point. It is true that the US international leadership is all in the president. It's not in these other places, pretty much. And so the president's ability, and by extension, I worked with the president's special envoy, which was John Kerry. The president's voice in the international discussion is very important. So I think that right now, the US is very eager to use the support that we have from our president out in the international community to kind of help build and support other countries as much as possible. If there were to be another president come in, we've experienced it before. I hope that doesn't happen. Let's see. But it would be kind of a similar type of story where we would probably continue with subnational actions.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to ask question? Yang lain dulu ya. Yang ya Mas yang di belakang.
Mbak, yang di
Yuk, silakan Pak. Ya.
Terima kasih. Dr. Hauptmann, I commend the presentation.
I'm sorry, Pak. Would
Yeah.
you like to mention your name and
Yeah,
where
yeah.
the institution you come from?
Warif, it's W-A-R-I-E-F.
Yes, thank you.
Warif Basori, contributing climate writer. I commend the presentation has analytical substance and fluency. On coal, now Indonesia has coal as the dominating elements in its energy mix. 63% of the energy mix is dominated by coal. Now, CGS, the Center for Global Sustainability, has cooperated with IESR, the Institute for Essential Services Reform, doing a joint study that was released just now in August, and it's called the Financing Indonesia's Coal Phase Out. Now, the prime takeaway of this study is coal power generation can be completely phased out by 2045. That's 15 years earlier than the 2060 or sooner target of the Indonesian government in reaching its net zero emissions. Now, 3 short questions. 1, how can the country's coal-powered plants be retired that sooner, 15 years from the 2060 target? 2, what financial incentives can the coal plant operators get to switch to renewables? And 3, going back to the IRA Act, what are US examples of this coal to renewable energy transition?
Okay, you may answer the question.
Thank you for the thoughtful question. That's good questions all around. So one thing I will note, so first of all, that's right. We do have a study, and happy to share that with anybody who wants. One of the 2 co-lead authors, Pak Fabi, is one of the lead authors, and Professor Sui here in the audience from CGS is also a lead author for that. I'm sure would be happy to answer questions after the event as well. But I'll do my best to answer your questions now. So one thing to note is that Indonesia's net zero is net zero broadly. It's not just only coal. And so that's just it's not saying just the 2 different things. And so when coal phases out is a contributor to net zero, but not the only thing. So other policies and other industry sectors will need to be thinking about what they can do. And I think that's part of why, even in the US, we will likely phase out coal by 2030, but our net zero goal is 2050, because there's lots of other things we need to be doing to phase out in energy, phase down emissions in energy and other sectors. Now, specifically to your question, I think one thing that's very important to note here is that all of us are aware that any one study is one study. It's a pathway to, in this particular one, it's a pathway to how those plants could be retired. And as we did the research, found that there were actually pathways that were more rapid than what people might have originally thought. And we hoped to demonstrate through that study how those pathways might be actually feasible, that would deliver benefits quicker, but also be feasible through specific financing strategies in ways that were, also viable for the industry and for the electricity sector ownership to be able to kind of move that rapidly. Now, that's part of our job as analysts in the research community, is to look for opportunities to do more, to ask the questions like, hey, we see a pathway that might be like this. And of course, that's one input to what all of the difficult decisions that have to be made at the political level for how to set and implement specific targets. And I would sort of look at this as always a two-part process. There's what we as the research community can do. I really like the idea of doing this collaborative type of research. We learn about what's possible. We kind of do better when we learn from each other. And then, of course, that will be one of probably many inputs to what happens, whether it's in the United States, when we do our work to support the US, one of many inputs. Similarly, on the Indonesian side, one study is one input to the overall conversation. And of course, we hope that it's helpful. And to the extent that it's wrong, want to hear answers as to what we could do better in the future, right? The third question that you asked is about the financing strategy. That report does go into some detail about how to think about the financing strategy. At the same time, though, I also think that we do have a lot of work to do as the US, Indonesia, and also the global partnerships that are emerging at this time to think about how that transition can be better supported. And one thing that I do observe, even in the last 12 to 18 months, is that the model for how the international community helps specific countries has been transforming. So rather than just being all of it going through like the UN Climate Convention and 70 countries say we need this, and then a bunch of other developed countries say, okay, we're going to mobilize 100 billion. It's much more targeted at like, what can the United States, working with other partners who are close to the United States, do to deliver a package of support that directly helps for the Indonesian situation in the electricity sector. And the model there, or an example there, is also what happened with South Africa. I won't say that's a perfect model, but like sort of getting a group of willing countries together, thinking about specific concrete actions that will be required to make happen a more rapid transition, and seeing if that's a conversation that's fruitful. So all very good questions, and thank you for that. And maybe on to the next one.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Yeah, anybody want to ask question first? Yeah, okay.
Right. Good morning. Thank you for the presentation, Professor. My name is Iqbal Ilham. I'm working on the clean, affordable, and secure energy for Southeast Asia. It is interesting to understand the all of society strategy that you presented before, how the US actually tried to implement this to support the climate action from all the stakeholders related. Similar with the spirit of the all of society strategy, in case we are in our project case, we are working on shifting the narrative of energy transition. One of the ways through making the energy transition as an inclusive topics. Interestingly, I understand the US is progressively activate the climate change mitigation effort from the perspective of local government and also from the private sector. Yet in Indonesia, which for now, I think it's safe to say that our country's objective is to secure the people by utilizing its natural resources. For example, several provinces, as you know, in Indonesia is heavy coal producers, which many people rely their lives on it, maybe the livelihoods of 2-3 generations already. What are the known practical takeaways and lessons learned from implementing the all of society that you think the Indonesian government need to replicate or need to explore more from the perspective of influencing the private sectors, for example, promoting green jobs or anything exploring even broader than the energy sector?
Thank you, Mr. Iqbal, for the question, and a great question. Again, I will start by saying this particular dimension of the energy transition is, I believe, probably the central fundamental question that will either make us successful in hitting 1.5 or have us miss it. And that is not just, can we physically find all the technologies and plug them in, because we know the answer to that is yes, we can. The answer is not, do we somehow or another in the world have enough finance and capital to buy all of that stuff? The answer is yes. It's not actually that crazy expensive to buy all this stuff compared to the world economy. The real question is, can we politically and in a way that is, equitable and supporting our communities, as well as maintaining the support and vibrancy of our economies, can we do it in a rapid way? Because a lot of what we're dealing with is the challenge of the pace, the challenge of the speed of having to do this quickly and not have the luxury of just waiting for everything to kind of gradually get old and retire, right? Like some of the stuff we're going to have to retire early, right? And so the question is, how do we kind of encourage that to happen while still maintaining support? And my first answer to your question is, globally, we don't know the answers to all of that stuff yet, right? I think this is where this is why I want to be working us all together to be thinking about new methodologies. How do we narrate this? How do we think about this new pathway for all of our different country contexts? That's what we haven't thought enough about that globally. We need to think more and rapidly, and hopefully we can be creative and quick about it as our research analytical communities, our political discussions are supporting those discussions in the politics. Now, the partial answer I can give to your question is, what has the US experience been like? And I think I forgot to throw this into your question as well. And it is we in the US are likely, our coal has been phasing out rapidly. Our fleet, our coal power plants are older than the coal power plants in Indonesia. And so some of them have been sort of naturally aging out, but there have been some coal plants that have been essentially retired early. And I think, again, that's what we have to be thinking about. How do we provide that strategy? And also, as we're doing that, we've been having to think about the politics of it, meaning I call it politics, but it's all about how things happen in the political discussion, right? So all the vulnerable communities. For example, our Inflation Reduction Act was essentially held up for a year because one senator in our Congress is from a coal mining state. And he wasn't at that point happy with the provisions. And eventually what happened was that we built in more provisions to help those vulnerable communities, coal mining communities, to transition. And I think that looking creatively about those kinds of support, how do we directly support the communities that need to go through the transition, the individual workers who might be 50 years old, 55 years old, they might not have a really, how do we take care of them? How do we make sure that they're okay? How do we also make sure that the investors who have put a lot of money into the infrastructure are also not, supported in a fair way? Like, let me put it that way. I think that's a very open definition of what supported in a fair way might mean, but supported in a fair way because the transition does need to happen. And so, but recognizing that investments have been made, how do we, for example, run the coal plants, maybe to a guaranteed minimum lifetime or some other kinds of methods, combining with some external finance that can make that, for the businesses and investors side of things, give them some fair deal so that they can transition out, maybe even as they're building new business lines that would take advantage of a new type of economic trajectory, right? So I don't have all the answers for Indonesia, but in the US, that's kind of what we've been seeing as part of how we've been dealing with it.
Okay, thank you. Next, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, after, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Wandi. I'm from the Executive Office of the President. I'm a friend of Fabi and Agusari. I just met when he go out from this room. I want to get your insight regarding the public support on climate policy. I mean, it's related to campaign or communication. Maybe you have some insight that we can learn from that, from your experience. In Indonesia and maybe in other countries, I think the issue of climate change is still in the elite. Yeah, I mean, in front of us, the road now, Merdeka Barat, just closed by the police because in a few moments there will be a demonstration regarding the price of the fossil fuel. So we know that every time we design a policy, there'll be many interests, conflicting interests from many stakeholders. And and we understand that now there is what so-called information bubbles. Yeah, so people have their own beliefs and their own interests. They talk to each other, and also we who have a bit of awareness about climate change policy. We sometimes also talk to those who already understand, preaching to converted. Yeah, but I think we need to widen our audience, and that's why for us it's very important to cooperate with IESR and add another network for this movement. I think this should be a movement. Climate change should become a movement. Policy analysts and private sectors and many stakeholders should be involved. That's why it's very important, this kind of event, this kind of discussion. But we need to learn from your experience also how to involve many more stakeholders and how you can ask them to give support for the climate policy. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And maybe, you know, I suppose one of the answers is, you know, we're very excited to meet you all and start these collaborations, but it's also been interesting for us to see how much is already happening through the Clean Energy Forum and other things that are happening already in Indonesia, and we're happy to be a supportive participant in those, as whatever makes sense. Now, to your other question of broadening the conversation and making it a movement, I think that's probably absolutely right. Like, and in the U.S., it's very big, very complicated story about how these pieces come together. But certainly something we've been doing is working, again, during the last many years, working with the subnational communities of various kinds, the different constituencies. As I see this all of society strategy, I feel like there's definitely a role for, as you mentioned, a critical central role for the multi-stakeholder discussion of industry, analysis, government people, other parts of civil society, ensuring that there's communication about what the opportunities are. I think that one of the core touch points in my mind, as I've kind of been in this field and watching things evolve in the US, but also in the global conversation, is how rapidly the world is changing. It's very rapidly changing. And generally speaking, yes, there's setbacks. There's the war in Ukraine, and there's some things that like that are always going to be happening. You're dealing with, you know, there's people, you know, unhappy about the fuel prices and things like this. And this is happening in all countries, in the US too, in different ways. But at the same time, the world is changing in many ways, in ways that will support us doing more and achieving more for climate change. And I think that those multi-stakeholder conversations that you're identifying are maybe the critical forum for us to make sure that we're all aware of and communicating about new ideas. It's about new ideas, learning about what's working well, there's lots of industry innovators that are out there that are doing really exciting work and making sure that we're learning from them. There's lots of subnational government innovators, leaders that are doing interesting things in their own communities or in their own provinces to deploy EVs or whatever. Learning from those experiences and sharing is critically important. And then, of course, I think there might well be opportunities, but up to the governments to decide what they might want to do to band together and support this kind of more sort of broad discussion. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer. Another question from this floor, and next we go to the online question. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Holtman. Wonderful lecture. I am Daniel, a solar policy analyst with the IESR. And I have two questions. The first one related to your time at the Department of State, with the setting the target and the strategy and the roadmap of the climate policies in the US. I was just wondering, Department of State is, from my understanding, is equivalent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, I'm trying to draw parallels here with the Indonesian, climate policy making. And in Indonesia itself, we are usually we divide into the Ministry of Forest, Environment and Forestry on the agriculture, forestry and land use sectors, and on the energy part from the Ministry of Energy. So I'm wondering whether how do you how does the United States divide these sector priorities in the Department of State, or whether you will collaborate with other departments on that. And on my second question, just a little more, it's related to the domestic manufacturing. Like we know from the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. will try to expand their domestic manufacturing on clean technologies, and I'm very curious in particular with solar in particular, because I know there has been some kind of tension with U.S.-China tariff import policies and so on, and the U.S. naturally will try to protect their domestic manufacturings. But I wonder what lessons we can learn from that in Indonesian context, because we do not have yet a strong solar manufacturing base here, but in most modelings, including our own and the IEA and even the government itself, solar will contribute greatly to our net zero pathways, at least 60% of electricity generation in terms of capacity by 2060 or so. So yeah, I want to know your perspective on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Very briefly, I think U.S. kind of bureaucratic architecture. By the way, we could talk more about that later because I don't want to put everybody to sleep like talking about the ministries. But your question is very good. One thing I will note is a slightly unusual feature of the way the Biden administration set up its climate and energy team is it. Generally speaking, you have in the U.S. A White House, which is the executive office of the president, as we call it, as well. The White House is a large executive office. They generally set the broad cross-administration policy sort of thinking, and that then feeds the different ministries. In some ways, feeds the different agencies. And they, for example, let me. That's generally how it works. That's how it worked when I was in Obama White House, and that's how it works sort of now. Although the Biden administration did a slightly different variation on it. Just again, probably won't be like this in the future, but like this is just how it is today, because of the people that Joe Biden asked to be leading his team. I think John Kerry is one of the world's most recognized climate celebrities. I don't know if he's the most, but like he has a lot of long seniority in our field and very diplomatic strength in the U.S. context, and I also think internationally. Like he's well known. He was our Secretary of State. He ran for president once or twice. I don't remember. He was a senator for a long time. So he's just a kind of long-term, very strong presence in U.S. politics. And because of that, Joe Biden asked him to be made a special position for him. It's probably won't be this in the future. Whenever Kerry retires, it won't be this. There probably will not be a new one. But where he is today is called the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. Technically speaking, that is a White House position that is based in the State Department. So I could get detailed on you. But so basically he's directly working for Biden based in the State Department because the State Department does all the international work. We also had in the US a national climate advisor who is primarily working on domestic climate policy, and Kerry and this other person, Gina McCarthy, would coordinate on domestic international work under Biden. And so that's how it worked. It's a little bit unusual compared to what the normal situation is. Both Gina McCarthy, the domestic advisor, has announced that she's retiring. And so we'll have kind of a climate coordinator coming in who is John Podesta, who was also under Obama a long time ago, sort of a senior advisor. But I don't want to get too much into US details, but sorry, it's just a little unusual. But yes, the State Department normally would have just sort of like authority on international and engagements like the Framework Convention on Climate Change, G7, G20, all those kinds of things. Because of who Kerry is and because of he's got this special position, he has more of a discussion in the domestic context as well than I think would normally be the case. But just like, oh wait, you had a second question. Sorry, I'll do your second question quickly.
Yes.
What was the second question again?
Do you? Oh, you have a second
Solar
question.
power.
I'm sorry.
U.S. a policy on solar energy.
The domestic manufacturing. Okay, I'll say that really quickly because I took so long on the first question. But yes, so there's some domestic manufacturing. All of you are familiar with this, how this is in countries. We all have our domestic industries. I think you're right. A lot of what's driven some of this has been China and the US. And I think there's been concern in our politicians that China, for example, was doing a lot of battery manufacturing and making sure that as we do a transition to electric vehicles, there was sufficient domestic production of those kinds of things so that the US is not dependent on Chinese mining and manufacturing. And that's more of a national security question and less of a climate strategy question. It's a different area of concern, right? So it's a kind of a national security discussion. On the solar panels, less of a national security discussion and a little bit more of a like, where should we be, doing gains of domestic or international trade? We've tried to do domestic manufacturing of solar in the US before. It sort of stalled out because China ended up being a very low-cost producer that we were not able to compete with. I don't even know, honestly, if the US will build a big solar manufacturing base or not. I do know that for security reasons, they do want to make sure that there's enough global supply of critical minerals for solar and batteries that allows us to kind of source those materials through diverse pathways. So I think that's the main goal of that. And then the manufacturing kind of a secondary goal.
Okay, yeah, you got the answer already. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hartman. And next we go to the question from the audience online. First question is from Ilham Surya from IASR. Prof. Nathan Hartman, how does the changing of government regimes, presidency affect the U.S. climate-related policies? How was the dynamics of presidency change affect those policies? You already answered that actually, but if you want to elaborate, please.
Yeah, I answered mostly that question in my talk and maybe some of the comments afterward, but it's a very good question. And I, by the way, just very sympathetic to the question. I understand we've had a lot of ups and downs in our climate policy. And I actually welcome people asking me this question because it's one that we don't have an exact answer to in the US, but I think we have a partial answer to, which is that, again, some of the policies that like, for example, where we are today, we have President Biden. There's going to be an election in a few months. At that election, the Democrats, Joe Biden's party could keep the Congress or they might lose the Congress. I actually am a little less worried about that now. I mean, for other reasons, I have politics myself, but like, I think it's less important for the climate now that we've gotten this infrastructure law passed. It's impossible for the next 2 years for even a Republican Congress to overturn that because Joe Biden he can veto it. So at least as Biden is president until 2024, everything's safe. He will continue to roll out new regulatory policies over his course of his presidency. Now, if there's a new president that comes in 2024, who's a different party, they could start to roll back some of the regulations. This is what we saw under Trump. That would have a slowing down effect. It would not be an immediate effect, and it would not be a fundamentally detrimental effect, but it would be a slowing down effect. I think it's highly unlikely, although you never know, that any new Congress and president would completely overturn the Inflation Reduction Act provisions for the reason that I mentioned before, which is it's much more about investment and spending, which generally is politically popular, as we all know.
In relation to that question, Prof. Hartman, you and your team, have experience to convincing the top leader on enhancing the climate change policy. What we would like to ask you is how the strategy you have, what is your strategy to convince the top leader? Because as we know already that the data on climate change not always has voice for the policymaker? How you convince them?
I think there's two parts of that question. And one part is our political leaders, of course, have to be motivated to do it from outside of my voice, right? It has to be something that comes from the politics, comes from their own vision for where they want the country to go, comes from the campaigning and the sort of engagement with the broader politics, right? So each leader has to set his or her own vision for where that goes. Now, sometimes you get a leader that says, okay, we want to do something. We want to do something good about climate change. But what do we do? It's in that context that I think the kind of analysis we do and the kind of engagement we do can be helpful. Because I'm going to say something about my government or my observations, and you might have a different situation here. But in my experience, government people may want to do the right thing, but they're often concerned about like doing too much, too fast. You know, they're concerned about overextending and committing to do too many things that they can't deliver on because it will be too difficult or politically costly or whatever. So there's always a little bit of a concern about maybe not going quite that long, quite that much is what maybe is the best strategy for the climate, or maybe even what we think is good for the economy, but they're a little bit hesitant to do it, right? That's mine, I think. So one thing that we can do as our community, as researchers or analysts or people working outside the government, is to show, as I call it, illuminate pathways to success. So like
illuminate pathway to success.
Yes, illuminate the pathway. You show the pathway. You say, we've done the analysis, we've done the math, we've talked to your people, we understand what policies might be feasible. Here's how you can add all the things together and do so in a way that is actually not that painful. Like, you know, you sort of show from your analysis that it can be done. Here is how you could do it. And a lot of times, it's not to say we're saying magic things. It's not we're saying like, oh, everything will be easy, everything's fine. You just say, look, here are the details. Here's the math. Here's what we are today. Here's what the technology costs are. Here's what we could get to by 2030, 2050, whatever the case may be. Here's how we could bring in finance. Here's how we kind of retire our coal, whatever the question is at hand. You sort of say, here's a pathway. And then you give it to them and you say, can I explain anything more? And they ask you questions. And sometimes that process of going back and forth can help and US context can help them say, maybe we could do more. Because I see, as you've shown it here, there's more opportunities than maybe we thought of. Remember, the world is changing quickly. And so like we can help them remember costs are lower. It's more possible. You've got all this stuff happening at the subnational level. And so, for example, even in I don't want to claim like credit for this in any way, but an observation I will make about our US 2030 NDC is that the original thinking from even the Biden administration on 2030 numbers, I won't say exactly what it was, but it was significantly less goal than what we ended up with. And I think that we ended up with the right number because of the conversations that were had between the Biden government I wasn't in there yet. I was at the University of Maryland, and then I went over and then I came back. So at that early stage, there were conversations between the government people and the analysts to sort of understand better what could be done. And eventually the number ended up much higher. So it's that kind of respectful interaction that happens when we can sort of bring some real evidence to bear. We all know we've all worked with governments. You know, evidence is not the only thing that matters. There's lots of other things that happen, but that can help the conversation.
Okay. Thank you for your tips. Next question from Tri Ligayanti from MOL. Am I correct? What kind of energy scenario which US choose towards NZA?
So good question. And if you really want all the details, you should download that report from the whitehouse.gov site because there's lots of text and scenarios in there. The short version is, I think about it in really 2 or 3 phases, and this is just a short recap. But in the near term, between now and 2030, we do a lot of effort toward deploying renewable energy, phasing out coal, and moving more rapidly toward electric vehicles. Like that's critically important now. In parallel to that, we're investing in building understanding of how to decarbonize in industry. And we're also, I hope, doing more than we're currently doing at expanding and working on our land sector emissions, right? The other thing that's between now and 2030 is reducing methane. I think that's another thing that I mentioned before. That's another sort of important near-term piece. Between 2030 and 2040, we then start to turn toward the slightly harder things to do. So expanding our forest sinks, making sure that the industry is starting to retool, making sure that new buildings that are being built are very low impact on the climate. And then by 2040 to 2050, we're then needing to phase out heavily emitting kinds of industrial processes. It doesn't mean the industries go away. It just means they have to shift their production. So if it's steel or cement or something like that, it's in that decade that we have to start pinching out the higher emitting strategies.
Thank you. Another question from online? Iya. Enggak. Ada pertanyaan lagi di online? Panitia? Oh, ada. Okay. From Dito Adisuryo from Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. Dear Prof. Nathan, given U.S. global leadership in several core areas such as aviation and military, where the U.S. is the key producer of those carbon-intensive sector, how U.S. will strategically implement the key policies in those sectors? Thank you.
Right, that's a very good question. The military side, I think that's actually something interesting where they have been starting to look at building military equipment and providing supplies through our military in a more efficient way. And in some ways that wasn't done because of climate. It was done because it's very expensive to ship fuel around in lots of different countries. And so the less fuel you have to ship around, the more efficient your military strategy can be. So that's not my key area of expertise, as you probably all know, but that's an area that's been interesting to watch as they've started to do this low emissions procurement strategy over the past 5 or 6 years. But that's about where my knowledge ends. I'm happy to help find other people who might be able to answer your questions better on that side, but I'm not the right person. Beyond that, the aviation, though, is something that we have followed relatively closely. Aviation, as I mentioned briefly in one or two of my comments, is one of those, as we call hard to decarbonize sectors. The reason is that it's very hard to build a battery jet that will go from Jakarta to Washington, D.C. We just don't have the technology today to run on electricity. And so we have to look to fuels that are more energy dense. It's an engineering question. It's not a question of political will. It's just, can the machine work? And so you need a fuel that is energy dense and is easily ported into quickly ported into an airplane. And an ideal kind of fuel for that is a liquid fuel, such as either jet fuel, which we know has an actual aviation emissions impact, or something like a biofuel, which on a net basis has not as much impact by far. And so it's possible that there might be a role for Indonesia on that hard to decarbonize sector in terms of providing a biofuel source. That's a complicated question. It involves land use. It involves global production chains. I don't mean to be recommending it specifically, but saying that it's certainly an interesting area to be looking at as a question. And then similarly, there will have to be, as I think the question was asking, innovation on the technology side of how the airplanes work, the actual machines. And I do know that over time, it's actually probably goes mostly unnoticed, but the airplane manufacturers, the big ones globally, have made tremendous progress in the past 20 years on how efficient those planes are. And we can now fly planes at roughly 20% more efficiently than we could before. And so you combine improving efficiency with potentially biofuels or even hydrogen fueling strategies, and we might have some opportunities. But again, aviation, hard to decarbonize sector, we do need to do more work on it. And I think that's an area for more collaboration.
Thank you. Next question from Muhammad Alwi. Maybe we can join some question, yeah. First, what type of mitigating measures or regulation did the U.S. government implement to have enough stipulation for fossil fuel business to close their facilities and relocate to green jobs, especially from the social and economic aspect. How can we make sure the Inflation Reduction Act effective? Another question, maybe we can join some question for the answer. Ada pertanyaan lagi? Yes. Okay. The second question from Queena. Earth Justice, in terms of GETP, what means are available to ensure transparency and inclusivity of the initiative? In which area can public, either US or Indonesian public participating? Sample submitting comments to ensure the initiative maximum impact. Another question, one more, if that will be okay. Ada pertanyaan lagi? Satu lagi mungkin bisa ditampilkan? Tidak, sudah selesai ya? Oh, this is the last question. Okay then, thank you. Yeah, you may answer the question.
Great. So I think excellent question on how to ensure that the Inflation Reduction Act is implemented effectively. I share your hope that we implement it effectively. One thing that is in my mind, I think others have probably thought a lot more carefully about it than I have, since I wasn't deeply involved in structuring the programs to assist the local populations around coal plants. But I know others have been thinking carefully about that. But ultimately, there is a lot of funding that has been made available to support energy transition in local communities. Some of that will be made available through what's called block grants. All that means is just a large chunk or block of funding is handed to a local government. And then with, of course, some mechanisms for oversight. It's not just completely free money, but there are some mechanisms for sort of like, asking the questions later. What have you spent the money on? What are your metrics of success? How many people have been retrained? Those kinds of things. But one of the strategies is, frankly, just kind of giving money to the local communities, because with the understanding that those local communities often have a local government who will be able to best understand how to allocate the funds most effectively for their domestic or their local situation. And other kinds of policies are more directed from the federal side. I think it will be an interesting question. That might be an area of actual mutual discussion as we implement the Inflation Reduction Act. Maybe we can, I'm sure there will be both positive stories and maybe a few missteps. There's always, with a big program like this, you're always going to learn some new lessons. So as we learn some lessons and work through it, maybe we could try to document and share that better, because it's one of those areas, like I mentioned earlier, which is why the question is very good, of shared, even though our country situations are quite different, we're all sharing this question of how do you support local communities in just transitions. And we can certainly learn some things from each other as we do that. The second question was about transparency in JETP. And that's an area where I'm afraid I don't actually know, and I really appreciate your question about it. I'm afraid I actually don't know the mechanisms that are being put in place for JETP. When I was at State, it was just sort of launching, and it is a G7 related process, and so I would expect that the transparency will come through G7 processes. But the specific mechanisms of, like, I wish I could tell you who to email if you have a question, or what website to go to and submit a comment. But I'm afraid I don't know that. But I suspect that as this program is getting off the ground over the next couple of months, I hope that there will be more opportunity. And I would certainly encourage people to be following it and submitting your comments and helpful criticisms as it advances.
So thank you. That's the last question from the audience. My last question, and also you can answer by giving the closing statement. You mentioned before that collaboration between stakeholders, various stakeholders and countries will be very important in achieving the target. Yeah, but that's what our President Jokowi also call out in the G20 meetings. Yeah, the collaboration, a fair collaboration. But you know that we face that the relation between developed country and developing countries. That's make a little more difficult, yeah, the negotiation and etc. Because of the developed country has the technology, has the money, and we, the developed country, we don't have that much what you have. So as an academic person, can you give suggestion on that matters?
So I think there's maybe, thank you for the question, and that's a great one for us to end on and kick off. Sort of, we can think of this as a first conversation of what might be many over time. One thing so I'll go back to, for example, the U.S.-China discussion that you mentioned earlier. So the U.S. and China are currently paused their collaboration. I hope that pause is short, but I recognize that our two governments have to figure that out themselves. And I will defer to them, of course, and when they choose to restart anything. But one of the elements that I think was good in what we did at Glasgow and what we've been doing over recent years is to set up a system that is government linked, but not government dependent. And what I mean by that is that I think it is important for the governments to be discussing directly, honestly, openly with each other what they can do together, to be transparently communicating to each other what they think each other might do better, what they can do better domestically. And that's part of what countries should be doing. And I'm not going to say one way or the other what each of our countries should be saying to each other at this point, but that's something the governments do need to do, have an open and direct, respectful discussion about each other's positions and what each other could be doing better, because they're never going to fully agree, right? So different countries will have ideas for what we might do better together. So those ideas should be communicated at the government level for sure. That's already going. But one thing that we can do that I think expands beyond that and frankly supports our governments doing better is to build a stronger non-governmental but governmentally linked network. So like this kind of event, for example, is a great example of that. It's hosted by the Executive Office of the President. What that means is that that I'm an independent university person, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, but I can certainly share some perspectives on my country's action, and in some ways what I think is a perspective that I have about what the opportunities might be globally and the opportunities even with U.S. and Indonesia. And I think that kind of conversation is very helpful. That's one thing we've set up in the U.S.-China discussion, and it's something that I think could do more of in U.S.-Indonesia context. Another dimension of your question is a little more pointed, which was, and I welcome that, which was, we know that Indonesia needs financing to support the energy transition here. And so I don't have myself the answer of like, what exactly number of dollars should the US put on the table? How should that be structured? What should the contracts look like? So I'm not going to speak to that. What I can speak to is that through discussions like this, I think we can create a better understanding of what the US can do to be helpful for Indonesia. Because if it's just the governments having those conversations, it's going to be limited in terms of what they hear and what they feel like they can sort of usefully respond to. But if we can start creating a larger conversation about what can the US do better at the governmental or even in the kind of non-governmental stakeholder engagements, that's kind of part of what we can do together. And I think that can also help our government in the US side calibrate better what it can do through JETP or through other programs that might happen in the future. So I think that's a way we can look at this conversation that might ultimately yield dividends down the road.
Thank you for your closing statement, Mr. Ned Haltman, Professor Ned Haltman. Let's give a big applause. Thank you for your insightful answer and presentation. I believe that we heard about we got lesson learned from American way climate change policy, but we believe that each country has their own condition, that we need to develop our Indonesian way also, because we have a different, we have a very large carbon storage in Indonesia, that's one of the things that we need to put in our regulation and policy also on NDC. And also, yes, what I really inspiring from your presentation before that. Yes, government policy playing significant role. Yes, top leader commitment playing significant role. But as you mentioned before, while at the Trump leadership, yeah, even though at the Trump leadership, the green economy still developed. Yeah, the action of the climate change still developed by industries and also civil society. That's very interesting and inspiring for me. Yeah, because as we know that we will have the new president for 2024, we don't know the policy and also his understanding, his or her understanding, I'm sorry, his or her understanding about the climate change issue. But what the key message I want to stress is about learn from America, the US, as long as the civil society and industry has understanding about the urge of the climate change action, yeah, we still can develop, even though the policy of the government and top leader not supporting that enough. Yeah, that's very important. And I want to encourage us all in this forum to never stop your effort to enhancing the climate change action and effort. Thank you. Once again, please give a big applause to our Professor Nathan Haltman. Thank you. Saya kembalikan Mbak MC, silakan.
Once again, thank you very much for Professor Dr. Nathan Haltman and Ms. Prita Laura. And for all the participants, offline or online participants, before we close this discussion, I would like to ask all the participants here to come to the stage